Hey guys, this is Rick. Last video said we'd go in a little bit on the never-ending block size debate in this video, but I realized I want to do a little bit of background to it first. There is this narrative in the BTC fork of Bitcoin that everybody should be running their own node. This is grade A nonsense for at least 3 reasons. So before we go into the actual block size debate, let's take a look at this node narrative. So let's take a little time to go through a lot of the nonsense that is unfortunately being told around Bitcoin nodes today. There is a lot of nonsense coming out of the BTC fork of Bitcoin. You'll notice that I'm describing Bitcoin BTC as a fork. That's because in August of last year, in August of 2017, what was Bitcoin BTC split into 2 different forks. One hard fork that became Bitcoin BCH with larger blocks. One soft fork that kept the name Bitcoin BTC, but which is fundamentally different from the Bitcoin BTC that existed before August of last year. So, the Bitcoin BTC fork has the narrative that every user of Bitcoin should be running their own full node, as they call it, or at least be able to run their own node. Because this is important, because decentralization. You know, nodes, as originally described in the Bitcoin white paper, meant mining nodes. What we today describe as miners. We don't talk of them as nodes at all anymore, but we describe them as miners. If you're reading the white paper, you can see this in language like they, meaning nodes, vote with their CPU power, indicating acceptance of valid blocks by building on top of them and rejection of invalid blocks by refusing to work on them. They here is referring to nodes earlier in the passage. You can find this in the white paper. And so non-mining nodes is a relatively recent construct compared to the white paper, and was a concept introduced much later in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And there are 3 powerful misconceptions about this concept of non-mining nodes. The first misconception I want to address is that users that don't run nodes are somehow second-class citizens in the Bitcoin ecosystem. The second misconception is that non-mining nodes would have any sort of power in the network. And the third misconception is that nodes are required for decentralization of the network. These 3 narratives all go hand in hand from the Bitcoin BTC fork of Bitcoin. Let's take them one by one. Users without nodes would be second-class citizens. You can hear this described, for example, in narratives like 80 to 90% of users should be running their own node, and again, if you don't, you're a second-class citizen. Just like in the last video, this is hogwash of the highest order. And the most common quote from me when others are using my quote to describe something in the Bitcoin ecosystem is a quote from one of the very first Bitcoin conferences in Prague 2011, where I was presenting. And I said at that conference that Bitcoin will do to banks what email did to the postal industry. Bitcoin will do to banks what email did to the postal industry. And this is still a very apt analogy. People can run their own email server. I'm running my own email server. Anybody can run their own email server to have an email address. But the ability for people to run their own email server has next to nothing to do with the success of email and that the postal services were outcompeted. If you're thinking back to this time, the key reason that email was adopted by everybody and their brother was something called Hotmail, which initially was spelt like this, because they were really hammering home the point that it was HTML. It's not even lead speak, it's some weird form of marketing. Today's equivalent of hosted service for mail, of course, would be Gmail, the one that most people use and which is not embarrassing to be seen with. But people who got their mail service from Hotmail then and Gmail today are in no way, shape, or form second-class citizens of the mail ecosystem. It's even probable and likely that people who use Gmail are more capable compared to me running my own server in a room just nearby here. Yes, it's actually physically here. And in the same way as mail, Bitcoin and the success of Bitcoin will depend on the usability of hosted services, for the bloody obvious reason that most people cannot set up a new Linux server, or in fact have any interest in doing so, just to pay their bills. Most people have absolutely no interest in learning this, just for the simple reason of handling money. This should be obvious. So in summary, there will be billions of Bitcoin users. Billions. 99.999% of them, at least, will not be running a node. Will not be running a node. Simply because there is no value for them in doing so. There is no added value whatsoever for them on taking on this burden. And that does not make them less capable or less worth as users of Bitcoin. Second misconception: nodes have network power. Nodes get to decide how the network works. No, they don't. Remember, we're talking about non-mining nodes. Non-mining nodes. The one advantage non-mining nodes have over hosted services is that they are direct spectators of what's happening on the network. They have the privilege of enjoying trustlessness. They don't need to trust anybody. We can compare this to a football game. The game takes place on the arena before us, among the people doing transactions and the miners, which in a football game would translate to the players kicking the ball around and the referees deciding on the rules and when the rules are invalid and when the rules have been broken and when they have been followed. Nodes here would be the audience. Nodes would not need to trust the TV networks and commentators to hear what was going on in the game, but they could see it directly with their own eyes. They get to observe directly what's happening on the network. But that doesn't give them a power to disagree or veto what's happening on the network. The audience of a football game can disagree all they like, going, "Oh, domarjävel, oh." And they do for that matter. But, the game will continue regardless of what they think. In the same way, a non-mining node can disagree with blocks all they like. But they're not rejecting these blocks by refusing to work on them, as we heard from the white paper. They're not accepting blocks by working on them. In fact, they're completely passive. They're completely passive. And so transactions and mining will continue completely regardless of what the non-mining nodes think about the blocks being mined. Non-mining nodes hold no power whatsoever in the network. The game will continue with or without them, and their presence makes no difference to the outcome of what the network is doing. The presence or non-presence of a non-mining node makes no difference whatsoever to the outcome of the Bitcoin network. For some, it makes direct sense. It makes economic sense to be a direct observer of the game. You might run a big company. You might not want to trust other people. And so, like watching a football game on location, you might want to be that direct observer. For most people, however, it'll be far sufficient to trust a few different sources. If 3 different newspapers write in the same way about the game that happened yesterday, then yeah, that's probably the way it happened. If some people are starting to describe it differently, then you have the option of digging deeper and finding primary sources. For most people, it'll be sufficient to trust a few different observer nodes or mining nodes and be content with that. Third misconception: nodes decentralize the network. Decentralization. Haven't we heard it so many times? And it's just being thrown around, you know. Decentralization, decentralization, decentralization. Without ever once being qualified or quantified. In other words, there's absolutely no description of what this word means. There is no way to tell whether it's increasing, whether it's decreasing, whether it's in a good state, whether it's in a bad state. Nobody has ever even stated why decentralization is necessary, what it is, or what an acceptable level of decentralization is. And you know, the most common answer you'll get to why decentralization is good, the most common answer you'll get to why decentralization is good is because it's less centralized. Decentralization is good because it's not centralization. Yeah, no shit, Sherlock, you just said that. Listen, this is circular reasoning at its finest. I wish I was making this up. I'm not. I'm really not. Decentralization is good because it's less centralized. Black is good because it's not white. White is good because it's not black. Up is good because it's not down, and down is good because it's not up. Yeah. You know, you can get sometimes a slightly better explanation. Decentralization is good because it's censorship resistant. Fine, but then it's the censorship resistance you want, and decentralization is a means to that. Don't confuse the means and the goal here. A lot of people do this. What you want, if you want censorship resistance, is permissionlessness, just like everybody can set up their own email server. Do not confuse that with the narrative that many nodes is good and more nodes is good, therefore even more nodes is better. That is not what decentralization means. That is not what permissionlessness means. That is not necessarily good for the network at all. The narrative has been more nodes is good because decentralization. And this does not make any sense at all. And this, of course, ties into the never-ending block size debate, which we'll come back to in the next video. Because there is this idea that everybody must be able to afford to run a node. This is not even true. You know, people are saying this and they're meaning something completely different. And I'll show you how. This everybody must be able to afford a node has been falsely translated into I must be able to run a node. I must be able to run a node on the old computer of my choosing. I must be able to run a node on my Sinclair ZX Spectrum, Amiga 500, Trash 80, because decentralization. Because decentralization. You know, these computers are not capable of large blocks. It's that simple. But today's computers are capable of gigabyte-sized blocks. And there is no reason to build a network for the future, which is limited by hardware which is not even available today because it's too bad. And it gets even worse. It gets even worse. Look at this. Look at this. When we were talking about gigabyte-sized blocks, which is nowhere near where we're at today, but we're arguing that it's completely possible on today's hardware, you will see people objecting like this. At 1 gigabyte blocks, some people will overrun their Comcast connection to their home with a $100 plan. And then they're telling their opponents to be serious. I'm not even making this up. They are saying serious and Comcast in the same tweet. Comcast, which was voted the most hated company in America twice in a row, is allowed to set the standards for what the banking system for the masses of the future will be, according to this narrative. This is fucking bullshit. They're actually saying Comcast and Sirius in the same sentence, or almost in the same tweet at least. People on bloody Comcast are not capable of large blocks. People on Comcast. All while, you know, places like Romania has 1 gigabit uncapped connections. It's apparently Comcast that must set the limits for what the next generation financial network globally can be capable of. No. Just no. No. And by the way, Sweden has already introduced 10 gigabit uncapped connections to households for, I believe, $35 US per month. So Comcast is not an argument. Comcast is not an argument. The fact that you're running on Comcast and can't run large blocks is not an argument. Which, unfortunately, this argument has been allowed to take hold, and therefore there's a shortage of transaction space today. And because of this shortage, as of when this footage is being shot, transaction fees for the BTC fork of Bitcoin, Bitcoin BTC, is $3 to $4. Follow me now in terms if it's decentralization you want, if it's real decentralization you want. A Bangladeshi goat farmer cannot afford $3 to $4 transaction fees because they live on about $2 per day. $2 per day. But a Bangladeshi goat farmer can afford to rent a server capable of gigabyte-sized blocks for $3.95 per month. They cannot afford transactions which are limited by bloody Comcast. But they can afford to run their own server capable of gigabyte-sized blocks. Capable of gigabyte-sized Bitcoin blocks. So, this third silly argument basically boils down to this. I cannot run world-scale services on my shitty Comcast connection, and therefore the world must suffer for it. I don't know whether this is more laughable or arrogant, but this is what the argument boils down to. So with this, we've covered these three misconceptions. Users without nodes are second-class citizens. No, they're not. 99.99% of users will not be running a node, and that's completely fine. In fact, it's required for mass-scale adoption, because you can't require somebody to set up a server just for that. Nodes have network power. No, that's nonsense. They don't. The network will proceed regardless of the presence or non-presence of a certain non-mining node. They have no influence whatsoever. And nodes decentralize the network. Well, yes, if you're talking about Bangladeshi goat farmers capable of renting a server capable of gigabyte-sized blocks, then you might get some decentralization. But this is used as a battering ram for hammering home the point that somebody must be able to run a full node on a shitty Comcast connection, which is just atrocious. These three are all false narratives. So, again, this sort of leads up to the block size debate. And people are asking me, well, you want larger blocks. Well, you can't increase the block size forever. But the thing is, that's exactly what you can do. It is mathematically absolutely sound to plan for increasing the block size forever. And I'll be showing exactly why with graphs and data in the next video.